The morning sun barely broke through the gray clouds as David stepped off the bus with his mother, clutching a folder that held his entire future. His sneakers, cleaned 3 times the night before, still showed signs of wear. His mother, Linda, smoothed down his shirt collar for the 100th time, her hands rough from years of scrubbing floors at the city hospital. "You'll do great, sweetheart," she whispered, though her voice trembled slightly. They both knew what this audition meant. It wasn't just about music anymore. It was about a way out, a chance at something bigger. The Riverside Academy of Performing Arts towered before them like a marble palace. Students in expensive clothes walked past, carrying instrument cases that probably cost more than Linda's monthly rent. Some glanced at David and his mother, then quickly looked away. David felt his stomach twist into knots. Inside, the hallway echoed with the sound of scales and warm-up exercises coming from practice rooms. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Everything gleamed. David had never been in a building this fancy before. He thought about his practice space at home, a cramped corner of their living room with a second-hand keyboard balanced on a folding table. "Number 47, David Peterson," a woman with a clipboard called out. Linda squeezed her son's hand. "I'll be right here waiting," she said, settling into one of the velvet chairs that lined the wall. As David walked toward the audition room, he heard voices coming from inside. The door was slightly open. "How many more of these do we have?" a man's voice asked, sounding bored and irritated. "Just 3 more, Director Thompson," another voice replied. Director Richard Thompson was a legend in the classical music world. He had trained at the finest conservatories in Europe and had performed in concert halls across 5 continents. He had been running this academy for 12 years, and his standards were impossibly high. Only the best of the best made it through his auditions. At least that's what the best of the best meant to him. David knocked softly and entered. The room was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a black grand piano sitting in the center like a throne. 3 judges sat behind a long table, papers spread out before them. Director Thompson looked up, his eyes scanning David from head to toe. The boy's worn clothes, his nervous posture, the folder with bent corners. Thompson glanced down at David's application form. "David Peterson," he read aloud, his tone already dismissive. "Age 14. Previous training." He paused, raising an eyebrow. "Private lessons with Mrs. Helen Kowalski." He looked at his fellow judges with an expression that said everything. "I'm not familiar with that name. Which conservatory did she attend?" "I don't know, sir," David said quietly. "She's my neighbor. She teaches piano from her apartment." One of the other judges, a woman with silver hair, shifted uncomfortably, but Thompson leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing on his lips. "I see. And how long have you been taking these lessons?" "5 years, sir." "5 years," Thompson repeated as if the words tasted bitter. He exchanged glances with the judge on his right, a thin man with glasses who was already reaching for the rejection form. "And what competitions have you won? What performances have you given?" David's throat felt dry. "None, sir. I just play because I love it." Thompson actually laughed at that. It wasn't a kind laugh. "You just play because you love it," he mimicked, shaking his head. "Young man, do you have any idea how many students audition for this academy every year?" "Hundreds. Students who have been training since they were 4 years old. Students who have won national competitions. Students whose parents have invested tens of thousands of dollars in their education." "I know, sir," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then why are you here?" Thompson asked bluntly. "What makes you think you belong in the same room as them?" The question hung in the air like smoke. David felt his face burning. Part of him wanted to turn around and leave, to spare himself this humiliation, but then he thought about Mrs. Kowalski, his elderly neighbor who had heard him playing simple melodies on that broken keyboard he'd found by the dumpster 5 years ago. She had knocked on his door and offered to teach him, asking for nothing in return. "Because Mrs. Kowalski believes in me," David finally said, lifting his chin slightly. "And my mom works 2 jobs so I can keep learning." Thompson's smile faded. He looked annoyed now. He glanced at his watch, clearly wanting this to be over. "Tell you what," Thompson said, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. "I've been doing this for a very long time. I can spot real talent in seconds. I can also spot when someone is out of their depth." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But I'm a fair man. I'll let you play. However, let me be clear about something." He stood up now, buttoning his expensive suit jacket. The other judges watched him nervously. Everyone in the music world knew that Thompson's ego was as large as his reputation. "If you sit down at that piano," Thompson continued, gesturing toward the grand instrument, "and you can actually play something at the level we expect here, something that proves me wrong about students like you." He paused for dramatic effect. "Then I will get down on my knees right here, right now, and apologize to you personally." The female judge gasped softly. The thin man with glasses looked shocked. They had never heard Thompson say anything like this before. "In fact," Thompson added, warming to his own performance now, "if you can play at our level, I'll kneel and apologize to every single student I've ever rejected who deserved a chance." The room fell completely silent. David felt like the air had been sucked out of his lungs. He knew what Thompson was really saying. He was making a joke, a cruel bet, because he was absolutely certain David would fail. Thompson sat back down, picking up his phone, already scrolling through messages. "Whenever you're ready," he said without looking up. David walked slowly toward the piano. His legs felt shaky. His hands were sweating. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. As he sat down on the bench, he noticed his reflection in the polished black surface of the piano. He looked small. He looked scared. He placed his fingers on the keys and took a deep breath. Behind him, he heard Thompson sigh impatiently. The thin judge was already filling out paperwork. They had already decided, but David wasn't thinking about them anymore. He closed his eyes and remembered why he loved music in the first place. He remembered the first time he heard a piano piece that made him cry. He remembered Mrs. Kowalski's patient voice guiding him through difficult passages. He remembered his mother humming while she cooked dinner after her long shifts, finding joy in small moments despite her exhaustion. Music wasn't about being better than someone else. It wasn't about expensive teachers or marble hallways. It was about expressing something true, something real, something that words couldn't capture. David opened his eyes and began to play. The first notes filled the room like water pouring into an empty glass. David's fingers moved across the keys with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a 14-year-old boy. He had chosen Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most challenging pieces in classical piano repertoire. Director Thompson didn't look up from his phone. He had heard thousands of auditions. In his mind, this one was already over before it began. But the female judge, Professor Patricia Williams, felt something shift in the air. She had been teaching music for 30 years, and she knew the difference between someone who had memorized notes and someone who understood them. Her pen stopped moving across her paper. David's hands moved faster now, building the melody like someone constructing a bridge, note by note. The piece demanded technical precision, but what came from the piano was something more. It was raw emotion translated into sound. Every chord progression told a story of struggle and hope, of darkness pushing against light. The thin judge with glasses, Dr. Henry Abbott, slowly looked up from his rejection form. His mouth opened slightly. This wasn't what he expected. Not even close. Thompson finally glanced up, irritation crossing his face. He was ready to stop the audition and send this boy home, but something made him pause. His finger hovered over his phone screen, frozen. David's eyes were closed now, his body swaying slightly with the music. Sweat formed on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the room. His fingers flew across the keys with increasing intensity. This wasn't just playing anymore. This was pouring his entire soul into sound. The music shifted into the second movement, softer now, more introspective. And this is where something magical happened. David began to play with a depth of feeling that made Professor Williams's eyes water. She tried to blink away the tears, but they came anyway. How could a boy this young understand sadness this profound? How could he express loneliness and longing with such clarity? But David knew these feelings. He knew what it was like to watch his mother leave for work at 5 a.m, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion. He knew what it was like to eat dinner alone most nights, heating up whatever she had left for him. He knew the weight of seeing other kids with both parents at school events, with new clothes and family vacations, while he wore hand-me-downs and spent summers in their apartment. He also knew joy, though. The joy of discovering that broken keyboard in the trash. The joy of Mrs. Kowalski's wrinkled face lighting up when he finally mastered a difficult passage. The joy of his mother's rare days off when they would sit together and he would play for her, and she would close her eyes and smile, forgetting her troubles for just a moment. All of this poured out through his fingers. Every sacrifice, every small victory, every quiet moment of beauty found in a difficult life. The music wasn't perfect in a technical sense. There were tiny imperfections that a trained ear could catch. But it was honest. It was real. And that made it more powerful than any flawless but soulless performance. Director Thompson's phone slowly lowered to the table. His face had changed completely. The smug confidence was gone. In its place was something that looked like shock, maybe even fear. Fear that he had been wrong. Fear that his entire worldview was cracking right before his eyes. Dr. Abbott's rejection form lay forgotten on the table. He leaned forward in his chair, drawn in by what he was hearing. His professional composure had completely disappeared. Outside in the hallway, people began to gather. The sound of David's playing carried through the heavy doors. Other students waiting for their auditions stopped their warm-up exercises. Staff members paused in their work. Even the janitor stopped mopping and stood still, listening. Linda, sitting in the hallway, heard her son's music and pressed her hand to her chest. She recognized the emotion in those notes. She heard her own story in them, her own struggles and dreams. Tears rolled down her cheeks and she didn't bother to wipe them away. Inside the audition room, David's playing reached its crescendo. His whole body was engaged now, leaning into the piano, his fingers attacking the keys with controlled passion. The music built and built, climbing toward something transcendent, something that touched that mysterious place where technical skill meets pure emotion and creates art. Professor Williams wasn't trying to hide her tears anymore. They flowed freely down her face. Dr. Abbott had removed his glasses and was wiping his eyes. Even they couldn't quite believe what they were witnessing. Thompson sat completely still, his face pale. His carefully constructed armor of superiority and judgment was crumbling. In all his years of training, performing, and teaching, he had forgotten something essential. He had forgotten that music wasn't about pedigree or money or the right connections. It was about truth. And this boy, this poor kid from nowhere with his worn-out sneakers and his unknown teacher, was speaking more truth than Thompson had heard in years. The final movement began, bringing all the themes together. David's hands danced across the keys with a kind of desperate beauty, as if he was trying to say everything he had ever felt but couldn't put into words. The music swelled, demanding to be heard, refusing to be ignored or dismissed. People in the hallway had their phones out now, recording. They knew they were witnessing something special, something that would be talked about for years to come. And then, after what felt like both an eternity and a single moment, the final chord rang out. David held it, letting it sustain, letting it fill every corner of the room before slowly, gently releasing the keys. Silence. Complete and total silence. David opened his eyes, suddenly aware of where he was again. His hands were shaking. His shirt was damp with sweat. He didn't dare turn around to face the judges. He had poured everything he had into that performance, and now he felt empty, vulnerable, exposed. The silence stretched on for 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15 seconds. Then Professor Williams stood up. She began clapping, her hands coming together with sharp, clear strikes that echoed in the quiet room. Her face was wet with tears, but she was smiling. Dr. Abbott stood next to her, joining in the applause. His usual stern expression had melted away into something softer, more human. Outside, the applause spread like wildfire. Everyone in the hallway began clapping. Students who had been competitors just moments ago were applauding with genuine appreciation. Staff members joined in. Even the janitor set down his mop to clap. David finally turned around on the piano bench, confused and overwhelmed by the response. But his eyes went immediately to Director Thompson, who remained seated, motionless, staring at David with an expression that was hard to read. Thompson's hands gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles were white. His jaw was clenched. For a long moment he didn't move at all. Then slowly, almost painfully, he pushed his chair back. The scraping sound cut through the applause. Professor Williams and Dr. Abbott stopped clapping, watching their director with wide eyes. Thompson stood up, his expensive suit suddenly looking too tight, too formal, too much. He walked around the table, each step deliberate and heavy. The room fell silent again. Everyone was watching. He stopped directly in front of David, who remained sitting on the piano bench. looking up at this powerful man who had mocked him just minutes earlier. Thompson's face was a battlefield of emotions. Pride fighting against humility, ego wrestling with truth. His mouth opened, then closed. He took a deep breath, and then, Director Richard Thompson, the most respected and feared music educator in the city, slowly lowered himself to one knee before a 14-year-old boy in worn-out sneakers. Director Thompson's knee touched the polished floor, and the sound echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. His head bowed slightly, and for several long seconds he couldn't speak. His throat felt tight, as if the words were physically stuck inside him. David sat frozen on the piano bench, not knowing what to do or say. He had never imagined this moment would actually happen. It felt surreal, like a dream that might shatter at any second. "I apologize," Thompson finally whispered, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat and tried again, louder this time. "I apologize to you, David. I was wrong." Completely wrong. He looked up, meeting David's eyes. There was genuine pain in Thompson's face, the kind that comes from confronting an ugly truth about yourself. "I've spent my entire career believing that talent only comes from the right schools, the right teachers, the right circumstances," Thompson continued, still on his knee. "I've rejected hundreds of students over the years, maybe thousands. Students who didn't fit my narrow definition of what a musician should look like. And I was wrong about all of them, too." Professor Williams had her hand over her mouth, tears still streaming down her face. Dr. Abbott stood with his arms crossed, nodding slowly. They had worked with Thompson for years and had never seen him like this. "You just taught me more about music in 10 minutes than I've learned in the last 20 years, Thompson said, his voice steadier now, "and for that I'm grateful. But I'm also deeply ashamed." He stood up slowly, his knees protesting after years of concert performances. He extended his hand to David, who hesitantly shook it. "Welcome to Riverside Academy," Thompson said. "Full scholarship. Everything included." The room erupted in applause again. Someone in the hallway let out a cheer. David felt dizzy, like the floor was tilting beneath him. Did that just happen? Was this real? Professor Williams rushed over, pulling David into a hug before remembering herself and stepping back professionally. "That was extraordinary," she said, wiping her eyes. "In 30 years of teaching, I've never heard anything quite like that." Dr. Abbott approached more cautiously, but even he couldn't hide his smile. "Young man, whoever Mrs. Kowalski is, she's a master teacher. I'd like to meet her." David finally found his voice. "She lives in my building, apartment 3B. She's 82 years old and she makes the best pierogies in the city." Everyone laughed and the tension in the room broke like a wave hitting the shore. But David's mind was already racing ahead. His mother. He needed to tell his mother. "Can I go tell my mom?" he asked. "Of course," Thompson said, gesturing toward the door. "We'll handle the paperwork. Take your time." David practically ran out of the audition room. Linda was standing now, surrounded by other parents and students who had heard everything. When she saw her son's face, she knew. She just knew. "Mom, I got in," David said, his voice breaking. "Full scholarship, everything." Linda pulled him into her arms, holding him tight. She was shaking, crying, laughing all at once. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. So proud. Around them, people were recording on their phones. Someone had already posted a video online with the caption, "Poor kid makes arrogant director kneel and apologize." Within an hour, it had 1,000 views. By that evening, 50,000. By the next morning, the video had gone viral, but David didn't know about any of that yet. He was too busy hugging his mother and trying to process what had just happened. Inside the audition room, Thompson sat down heavily in his chair. His hands were trembling. Professor Williams placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "That took courage, Richard," she said softly. "It took a 14-year-old boy to show me what I've become," Thompson replied, staring at his hands. "What kind of teacher does that make me?" "The kind who can still learn," Dr. Abbott said, surprising them both. He wasn't known for being particularly warm. The kind who can admit when he's wrong. "That's rarer than you think." Thompson nodded slowly, but he didn't look convinced. The weight of his past judgment sat heavy on his shoulders. How many talented kids had he turned away? How many dreams had he crushed with his arrogance and prejudice? By the time David and Linda left the academy that afternoon, David's phone was buzzing constantly. Friends from school were texting him, having seen the video online. News outlets were calling, asking for interviews. The local newspaper wanted to run a story. "What's happening?" Linda asked, looking at the phone in confusion. David scrolled through his notifications, his eyes getting wider. Mom, people are sharing the video. Like a lot of people. That night, they sat together in their small apartment, watching as the story spread across social media. The video had been viewed over 2 million times. Comments poured in from around the world. This is what music should be about. That director got exactly what he deserved. Finally, someone standing up to these elitist institutions. This boy has more talent in his little finger than most professionals. But not all the comments were positive. Some people criticized Thompson harshly, calling him names, demanding he be fired. Others said the whole thing was staged, that no one plays that well without proper training. David's phone rang. It was Mrs. Kowalski. David, dear, what on earth is going on? My phone hasn't stopped ringing, she said, sounding flustered. Mrs. Kowalski, I got into the academy. Full scholarship, David explained. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then he heard her crying. Oh, my boy. My dear boy, she said through her tears. I knew you could do it. I knew from the moment I heard you playing that first song on that broken keyboard. They want to meet you, David said. The professors. They're calling you a master teacher. Mrs. Kowalski laughed through her tears. A master teacher? I'm just an old woman who loves music. You're more than that to me, David said quietly. Over the next few days, life became a whirlwind. Reporters showed up at their apartment building. The Academy's phone lines were jammed with calls. Director Thompson released a public statement, acknowledging his biases and promising to reform the audition process. But with the attention came pressure. The music world was watching now. Everyone wanted to know if David was really as good as that one performance suggested, or if it had been a fluke. Classmates from his old school suddenly wanted to be his friend. People he'd never met were asking for favors. Linda worried about how her son was handling it all. She noticed he wasn't sleeping well, that he seemed anxious and overwhelmed. The simple joy he used to find in playing piano seemed clouded now by expectations and judgment. One evening, about a week after the audition, David sat at his keyboard, but couldn't bring himself to play. His fingers hovered over the keys, but nothing came. He felt blocked, frozen by the weight of everyone watching, everyone waiting for him to prove himself again. Linda found him like that, staring at the keyboard with tears in his eyes. What's wrong, sweetie? She asked, sitting beside him. What if I can't do it again? David whispered. What if that performance was just luck? What if I get to the academy and everyone realizes I don't belong there? Linda put her arm around him. David, look at me. He turned to face her, his eyes red. You've always belonged, she said firmly. Not because of that audition. Not because some director kneeled down. You belong because music lives in your heart. That hasn't changed. That will never change. David nodded, but the fear didn't leave his eyes. Starting at that academy is going to be hard, Linda continued. There will be kids there who've had every advantage you haven't had. They might not accept you right away. They might even resent you. That's what I'm afraid of, David admitted. I know, baby. I know. Linda squeezed his shoulder. But you've already done the hardest part. You've stayed true to yourself. Don't lose that now. As David tried to sleep that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real challenge was just beginning. The audition had opened a door, but walking through it might be harder than he ever imagined. David's first day at Riverside Academy arrived with the kind of autumn morning that should have felt full of promise. Instead, he felt sick to his stomach as Linda drove him to campus in their old car that made concerning noises whenever it turned left. The parking lot was filled with expensive vehicles. BMWs, Mercedes, even a Tesla. Linda's car sputtered and coughed as she pulled into a spot far from the entrance. Neither of them mentioned it, but they both noticed the difference. You ready? Linda asked, though she looked more nervous than her son. Not really, David admitted. That's okay. Nobody's ready for their first day. She squeezed his hand. Remember what Mrs. Kowalski told you this morning? David smiled slightly, recalling his elderly neighbor's words at 6 in the morning when she'd knocked on their door with a bag of fresh pastries. Play with your heart, not your head. The rest will follow. Exactly, Linda said. Now go show them what you're made of. David grabbed his backpack, which looked shabby compared to the leather bags he'd seen other students carrying, and walked toward the building. Behind him, he heard his mother's car struggle to start, then finally roar to life. He didn't turn around. He didn't want to see the looks on other people's faces. Inside, the hallways were even more intimidating than he remembered. Students moved in clusters, laughing and talking about their summers in Europe or their private lessons with famous musicians. David clutched his schedule and tried to find his first class. "Hey, you're that kid from the video," a voice said behind him. David turned to find 3 students staring at him. 2 girls and a boy, all dressed in expensive clothes that looked effortlessly perfect. "Yeah, that's me," David said, trying to sound confident. "I'm Bethany," one of the girls said, tossing her long hair. That was quite a performance, very emotional. Something in her tone made David's stomach tighten. It wasn't quite a compliment. "Thanks," he said carefully. "Must be nice getting in on a viral video instead of actual training," the boy said, smirking. "My parents spent $30,000 on my education before I even auditioned here." "I didn't plan for the video to go viral," David replied, feeling his face heat up. "Of course not," Bethany said sweetly. "It just happened. How convenient." They walked away laughing, and David stood there feeling like he'd been punched in the gut. This was only the first 5 minutes, and it was already worse than he'd feared. His first class was music theory with Professor Williams, the same woman who had cried during his audition. She greeted him warmly when he entered, which made some of the other students exchange glances. "Everyone, this is David Peterson. I'm sure many of you have seen his audition," Professor Williams said. "David, you can sit anywhere. Every seat seemed threatening." David chose one near the back, trying to make himself invisible. A girl with red hair sitting next to him offered a small smile, which was the first genuinely kind gesture he'd received all morning. "I'm Rachel," she whispered. "Don't worry about those jerks in the hallway. They're just jealous." "Thanks," David whispered back, grateful for even this small kindness. The class itself was challenging but manageable. David had studied theory with Mrs. Kowalski, though not at this advanced level. He found himself struggling to keep up with terms and concepts the others seemed to know instinctively. Between classes, he called his mother during lunch. He sat alone in a corner of the cafeteria, watching groups of students who had clearly known each other for years. "How's it going?" Linda asked. He could hear the concern in her voice. "It's fine," David lied. "Just different. You sure? You sound tired." "I'm okay, Mom, really." He didn't want her to worry. She had enough on her mind with her double shifts at the hospital. The afternoon brought his first piano class, a group lesson with 5 other students. Director Thompson himself taught this class, which made David even more nervous. Would Thompson treat him differently now? Would the other students resent any attention he received? Thompson entered the room with a different energy than David remembered. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something more humble, more human. "Good afternoon, everyone," Thompson said. "Before we begin, I want to address something. Some of you may feel that David received special treatment because of his viral audition. I want to be clear. David earned his place here through his talent and his heart, the same as each of you." A blond boy in the front row raised his hand. "But sir, he doesn't have the same training we do." "How is that fair to us?" Thompson nodded as if expecting this question. "That's a fair point, Christopher. Let me ask you this. Do you play piano to be better than others? Or do you play to express something that can't be said with words?" Christopher hesitated. "Both, I guess. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to excel," Thompson said. "But if you focus only on competition, you miss the point of music entirely." David reminded me of that. He reminded all of us. The class moved on to technique exercises, and David tried his best. But it was clear the others were more advanced in certain areas. Their finger exercises were cleaner. Their sight reading was faster. Years of expensive training showed in every movement. David felt himself shrinking, doubt creeping in like cold water. Maybe they were right. Maybe he didn't belong here. After class, Thompson asked him to stay behind. David's heart raced. Was he already being kicked out? "How are you managing?" Thompson asked once they were alone. "Fine," David said, the same lie he'd told his mother. Thompson studied him carefully. "David, I may have made many mistakes in my career, but I've been teaching long enough to recognize when a student is struggling." "What's really going on?" The kindness in his voice broke something open in David. "I don't fit in here," he admitted. "Everyone else has had private lessons since they were little kids. They've been to competitions. They know all this stuff I've never even heard of, and they all think I only got in because of the video. Thompson sat down on the piano bench, gesturing for David to sit beside him. Can I tell you something? When I was first studying in Vienna, I felt exactly the same way. I came from a small town in Ohio. My father was a mechanic. Everyone else came from money, from musical families. I spent my entire first year convinced I'd made a terrible mistake. David looked at him in surprise. Really? Really, Thompson confirmed. And you know what? Some of those feelings never completely go away. Even now, sometimes I wonder if I belong in these rooms. He gestured around at the elegant studio. But here's what I learned. Belonging isn't about where you come from. It's about what you contribute. But what if I can't keep up? David asked quietly. Then you work harder. You ask for help. You practice until your fingers hurt. Thompson paused. But David, technique can be taught. What you have, that ability to make people feel something when you play, that can't be taught. That's rare. Don't lose that while you're trying to catch up on the technical stuff. David nodded, feeling slightly better but still uncertain. That evening, Mrs. Kowalski knocked on their apartment door just as David was about to practice. She carried a container of soup and a determined expression. Your mother told me you had a rough day, she said, settling into their worn couch. So we're going to have lesson. Not academy lesson. Our lesson. For the next hour, Mrs. Kowalski had David play the simple pieces he'd first learned 5 years ago, the ones he'd practiced on that broken keyboard. There were no judges, no competition, no pressure. Just an old woman and a young boy sharing their love of music, you see, Mrs. Kowalski said when they finished. This is why you play. Not for them. For this feeling right here. David felt tears prickling his eyes. I'm scared I'm going to fail. Then you fail, Mrs. Kowalski said simply. And then you get up and try again. That's life, darling. But David's fears proved more justified than he knew. 2 weeks later, Linda collapsed at work. The hospital called David at school. She'd been pushing herself too hard, working extra shifts to help cover his school expenses, even though the scholarship covered tuition. When David arrived at the emergency room, still in his school clothes, he found his mother in a hospital bed, exhausted and dehydrated. The doctor said she needed rest, real rest, but they both knew that wasn't possible. Bills didn't pay themselves. Sitting beside his mother's bed, holding her hand, David made a decision. He couldn't let her destroy her health for his dreams. He would leave the academy, get a job, help support them both. Don't you dare, Linda said weakly when he told her. Don't you dare give up on this. Mom, look at you. This is killing you. I'm fine. I just need to rest for a few days, but David knew better. Something had to change. He just didn't know what. The next morning, he went to Thompson's office to withdraw from the academy. But before he could knock, he heard voices inside. Thompson was meeting with someone. David stood outside Thompson's office door, hand raised to knock, when he heard Professor Williams's voice from inside. Richard, we need to do something. That boy is carrying too much weight on his shoulders. His mother is in the hospital and he's trying to keep up with coursework while working a part-time job at night. David froze. He hadn't told anyone about the job at the grocery store. He'd been stocking shelves from 8 to midnight, sleeping 4 hours, then coming to class exhausted. I know, Thompson replied, his voice heavy with concern. I've been thinking about this constantly. We gave him a scholarship, but that doesn't pay for his mother's medical bills or their rent or food. There has to be something we can do, Professor Williams insisted. David heard papers shuffling. Then Thompson spoke again. I have an idea, but I need to make some calls first. Give me until tomorrow. David quietly stepped away from the door, his withdrawal speech forgotten. He wandered the hallways in a daze, ending up in one of the empty practice rooms. He sat at the piano but didn't play. He just stared at the keys, feeling lost. Rachel, the red-haired girl from his theory class, found him there an hour later. Hey, you missed lunch, she said, peeking her head in. You okay? Not really, David admitted. There was no point in lying anymore. Rachel came in and sat beside him on the bench. Want to talk about it? And suddenly David did. He told her everything. His mother in the hospital. His late-night job. The way he felt like he was drowning, unable to keep up with school, work, and worry all at once. The words poured out like water from a broken dam. Rachel listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. My dad left when I was 8, she finally said. My mom raised me and my 2 brothers alone. She cleaned houses to pay for my piano lessons. I know it's not exactly the same, but I understand what it's like to watch your parents sacrifice everything. David looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. How did you deal with it? I let people help us, Rachel said simply. That was the hardest part. Accepting help felt like admitting we couldn't handle it alone. But my mom finally realized that community isn't about being strong enough to never need anyone. It's about being brave enough to accept support when you do. The next morning, David was called to Thompson's office. His heart pounded as he walked through the door, expecting bad news. Instead, he found Thompson, Professor Williams, and Dr. Abbott all sitting together looking oddly pleased with themselves. David, please sit, Thompson said, gesturing to a chair. David sat, gripping the armrest nervously. We've been discussing your situation, Thompson began, and we've come up with a proposal. The academy has connections with the city hospital system. We've arranged for your mother to receive comprehensive care through our employee health program. David's mouth fell open. But she's not an employee. She will be, Professor Williams said, smiling. We're creating a position for her in our administrative office. Part-time, flexible hours, light duties. It'll give her health coverage and a steady income, and she can rest properly while she recovers. I don't understand, David said, his voice shaking. Why would you do this? Thompson leaned forward. Because you've taught me something important, David. Music isn't just about individual talent. It's about community, about lifting each other up. I spent years being the kind of teacher who tore people down. I don't want to be that person anymore. There's more, Dr. Abbott added. We'd like to offer Mrs. Kowalski a position as a guest instructor. 1 day per week, teaching students who come from non-traditional backgrounds. We're starting a new program specifically for talented kids who might not otherwise have access to this level of training. David felt tears streaming down his face. He didn't even try to stop them. I don't know what to say. Say you'll stay, Professor Williams said gently. Say you'll keep playing, keep growing, keep reminding us why we fell in love with music in the first place. David nodded, unable to speak. Over the next few months, things slowly changed. Linda started her new position at the academy, working just 20 hours a week in a comfortable office job that didn't destroy her body. Her health improved dramatically. She even started to smile more, the worry lines around her eyes softening. Mrs. Kowalski became a beloved figure at the academy. Her teaching style was completely different from the formal approach most students were used to. She taught from the heart, focusing on emotional connection before technical perfection. Students who had been struggling suddenly found their passion reignited. David's own journey at the academy transformed as well. It didn't happen overnight. There were still students like Bethany and Christopher who resented him, who whispered that he'd gotten special treatment. But slowly others began to see past his background to his genuine love for music. Rachel became his closest friend, and through her, he met other students who came from working-class families. They formed their own small community within the larger academy, supporting each other through the challenges of fitting into a world that wasn't built for people like them. David's playing evolved too. With the pressure of financial worry lifted, he could focus on growth rather than survival. He practiced technique with Professor Williams, studied composition with Dr. Abbott, and once a week, he still had lessons with Mrs. Kowalski in her small apartment, eating pierogies and playing the music they both loved. The winter concert arrived, the Academy's biggest event of the year. Parents, donors, and music critics from around the city would attend. David had been chosen to perform, which some students complained was favoritism. But Thompson had been firm in his decision. The night of the concert, David stood backstage, his hands sweating. His mother sat in the third row, wearing a new dress she'd bought with her first paycheck. Mrs. Kowalski sat beside her, beaming with pride. As David walked onto the stage, he heard scattered applause. He sat at the grand piano and looked out at the audience. For a moment, he was that scared 14-year-old boy again, facing Director Thompson's mockery. But then he saw his mother's face, saw Mrs. Kowalski's encouraging smile, saw Rachel giving him a thumbs up from the wings. And he remembered why he played music in the first place, not for recognition, not to prove anything to anyone, but because music was the language his heart spoke when words weren't enough. He began to play a piece he'd composed himself, something he'd been working on for months. It told the story of his journey, from finding that broken keyboard in the dumpster to this moment on stage. Every struggle, every triumph, every moment of doubt and hope woven into the melody. The audience listened in complete silence. Even Bethany and Christopher, sitting with their parents in the front row, seemed moved. When the final note faded, the applause was thunderous. But more importantly, David felt at peace. He'd found his place not by becoming someone else, but by staying true to who he was. After the concert, Thompson approached him backstage. "That was beautiful, David. Your composition showed remarkable maturity." "Thank you, sir," David said. "No," Thompson replied, shaking his head. "Thank you. You've changed this academy. You've changed me. We're launching the scholarship program for underserved students next year, and it's because of you. We're calling it the Peterson Initiative." David felt overwhelmed. "I don't deserve that." "You deserve that and more," Professor Williams said, joining them. "You reminded us that talent exists everywhere, but opportunity doesn't. We're going to change that." 5 years later, David stood in the same audition room where his journey had begun, but now he wore a teaching assistant badge. He was 19, preparing to graduate and head to an international conservatory for his master's degree. But today, he was helping with auditions for the Peterson Initiative. A young girl from the south side of the city sat at the piano, nervous and hopeful, wearing shoes that had seen better days. Director Thompson, now softened by age and humility, sat at the judge's table beside David. "Whenever you're ready," Thompson said gently to the girl. She began to play, and David heard it immediately. That raw emotion, that genuine love for music that couldn't be faked or bought. He glanced at Thompson, who was smiling. After the girl finished, David stood and applauded. Thompson joined him, then Professor Williams, then everyone in the room. "Welcome to Riverside Academy," David said to the girl. "You're going to do amazing things here." As the girl's mother rushed in from the hallway, tears streaming down her face, David thought about Mrs. Kowalski's words from years ago. "Play with your heart, not your head. The rest will follow." He'd followed that advice, and it had led him here. To a place where he could help others the way he'd been helped, where he could pass on the gift that Mrs. Kowalski had given him, that Thompson had learned to give, that this entire community had embraced. The cycle continued. And somewhere in the practice rooms above, someone was playing a simple melody on the piano, just beginning their own journey, just discovering their own voice. Music had brought David here, but it was compassion, community, and the courage to stay true to himself that had allowed him to thrive, and that, he realized, was the real lesson. The one worth sharing with every student who walked through these doors, regardless of where they came from or how much money their parents had. Everyone deserves a chance to find their voice. Everyone deserves to be heard. That was the legacy David hoped to leave behind. Not as the boy who made a director kneel, but as the young man who opened doors for others the way doors had been opened for him. The music played on, and the story continued, one note at a time.